general discussion of the main takeaways that people have, and if you need to go up and refresh your memory from some of the sheets, please do so. So main takeaways from discussions around this, thinking about a relationship with a co-op. What do people come up with? Yeah.
That a relationship with a nonprofit can be very helpful in if the co-op needs training or support or resources for a particular program that the nonprofit could serve as a fiscal sponsor for, but it all seems to hinge on similarity of mission, or overlap of mission.
Mission overlap. Mission match. What else are people's main takeaways?
I was just thinking more about, I noticed that list over there said a lot about ways that co-ops can kind of benefit from nonprofits, but I also was thinking about there's a lot of benefits that co-ops can offer to nonprofits in terms of horizontality and like democracy that sometimes isn't really present in nonprofits or hasn't been in the past. So just thinking about that, and then also like just thinking about Soul Chariots, we have like an informal relationship with Recycle-A-Bike in Providence, and like they've offered us tools and equipment that we haven't had, and at the same time we're able to offer them services to help like promote their events. Like we can bring our kitty cabs to help improve one of their fundraising events or like more attention to their nonprofit.
So that's an example of a really horizontal collaboration between two community enterprises. One chose a nonprofit form, one chose a co-op form, and they're collaborating to bring their missions forward. But not necessarily in the formation of a co-op or in the formation of a nonprofit or the sustaining of a nonprofit. So you don't get into some of those trickier questions in that collaboration. That's a good example. Anything else jump out at people with this question? Okay, so next main topic, examples of successes. Successful relationships is what stood out from people's discussions over here.
Does somebody that wrote something on there want to talk about what they wrote and why?
There are no examples of successes on there.
I was going to say that one thing that really struck me was trying every nonprofit cooperative relationship that I could think of that are like especially like some local smaller ones, actually wasn't entirely a success. Like I don't want to call them failures because I think, probably there were like successful parts and not so successful parts, but overall like those, in some cases, those cooperative, or yeah, the co-ops no longer exist because they failed from like the business perspective, like to generate enough income. Or in some cases, there's just like ongoing strife between the co-op and the nonprofit. So what really struck me is like I couldn't think of any examples, concrete examples.
I think maybe if the reason why the nonprofit started the co-op is clear, so incubation versus like for some other reason, like a revenue stream or to provide itself the service, like that might kind of dictate whether or not it's like a success in terms of becoming, if you define success as becoming like an independent entity. I think maybe it matters like why the nonprofit started the co-op in the first place.
Well, the Wellspring model, or the model where anchor institutions provide a client or service base for the co-op, seems to be successful, but I don't really know enough about them.
Well, they haven't started yet.
The one in, yeah.
So especially if people are thinking of fast startups to scale, but we're focusing on for this exercise, because that opens a whole nother question, right? nonprofits as main clients of co-ops. Well, that's an important one, and we should probably get into it. But for this exercise, mostly what we're talking about are mission-based nonprofits that have some sort of arrangement with co-ops or incubation or support or technical assistance. So are there any, does it work if a nonprofit has the idea for a co-op and wants to start it and get it going? Is that possible? As opposed to the other way around, a group of people have an idea for a co-op, approach a nonprofit, get the training they need, and then go start it. Does it work the other way around? Does it work nonprofit starting it?
Could it just be harder?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's possible, but it also seems like there's so many problems related with that, like, mostly that would, I feel like mostly that would stifle the co-op, but maybe also like drain resources away from the nonprofit. Like, one thing that kept coming through my mind is in the group that I'm working with, there's a very small board that's it's the most active members of the organization comprise the board. And if they're all right now interested in this idea and thinking like we could put energy towards doing a co-op, but then I'm starting to get the worry because it's like being a small board of a small nonprofit is hard enough as it is as volunteers, raising money, holding events, getting members, et cetera, like running programs, et cetera, and like I'm starting to freak out a little bit. Like, I don't know if I want you to be coming to like meetings all the time to start a cooperative business, because how much energy do you have? And like, would that drain people's energy away from what the nonprofit needs them to be doing to maintain the nonprofit? I don't know, maybe it wouldn't, but like, I don't know. I know I would be overwhelmed with all of those duties.
So Toxic Soil Busters might be an example of where Mr. Roots, the nonprofit, was very involved in starting the co-op. And it never really became independent, and now the goal is not for it to be independent, but that doesn't mean there was no success in it, right? Many youth have come through it, gained skills. It continues to be an important training place for youth. Lots of other things were accomplished there. It was less grant dependent, taking that approach and doing fee-for-service work. So it does kind of, as Nene said, depend on how you define success. If your goal is to have an independent co-op, maybe that approach is very problematic for the reasons we just discussed. Anything else on this that stood out to people, successful co-ops? I just want to point out there are some examples up there, like the Dahlia Cleaning Co-op in Austin, Texas, where they had the idea of a cleaning co-op. They approached Cooperation Texas. Cooperation Texas did a training with them. They are now a functioning worker cooperative. There are ways that these things happen, and especially groups of people who wouldn't otherwise have access to those kind of training resources. Some people are very purist about this, right? No nonprofit involvement, but those are often in very privileged areas that don't have, where they can go to family, friends, and get startup capital. Anything else?
I just have a question that came to mind when I was reading or talking about troubling hot sauce co-op. But can a co-op ever kind of provide a stream of revenue to a nonprofit to help them move away from grants, or would that undermine the purpose of a co-op, where all like the money can come in to go to workers and go back to the co-op? Is there ever a model that makes sense where co-ops can also help provide funding to nonprofits if the nonprofit is helping that as well?
I heard that question a few times. What do people think on that?
I kind of talked to you guys about the co-op in DC, which is a coffee. It's a work-owned coffee, and they have like a bookstore nonprofit with the stream of the co-op. I mean, it's not a huge coffee and it's not a huge bookstore, but they do whatever they want with it, and they don't depend on grants. It's like part of the revenues from it are going to the nonprofit.
I was talking about this with Josie. I think My personal opinion about it is that it's almost categorically a bad idea to try and start up an independent business that's going to incorporate as a way to make money for the nonprofit. That a lot of times nonprofits incorporate social entrepreneurial ventures into their programs, and that looks like youth grow defraying the expenses of paying their youth to learn about food justice by paying their wages by the work that they do, or toxic soil busters being able to pay their youth to go to all these trainings and speak at all these conferences, do education in schools through money that they get through outreach grants that they sometimes write themselves, or the business aspect of doing that sort of mediation. Or I think I was just talking to Julian about how he's, maybe not looking at incorporating Green Drive, but looking at it as a social venture that can then serve as the breeding ground or the training where people can then get the know-how and the resources to go out and start their own cooperatives that aren't linked, the nonprofit isn't dependent on from the beginning, or that won't reach away resources from the nonprofit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that a lot of nonprofits get the idea about having a co-op as an income stream from the modern network of cooperatives, where there's a system that, I don't know the numbers exactly, maybe somebody else does, that every co-op in the network puts in a percentage of its net profits into kind of a parent organization, which then turns around and provides education and training, research and development, technical assistance to the cooperatives. And the Arizmendi Association of Cooperatives in California has tried to do that too. They have a system where 25% of the net profits of all of their partner co-ops goes back into Arizmendi to provide training and education. So I think it's possible that it's a viable thing if the whole purpose of the nonprofit is to incubate co-ops. Like, you maybe have a chance if you incubate lots of co-ops and they're very successful, you have a chance of developing an income stream that way and paying for your work as co-op developers that way. But I don't think that you could fund a larger nonprofit that has a larger vision than that. It would be really, really difficult to just come up with the money to do co-op development that way, let alone support a bigger vision.
I think that if you think of like a nonprofit that is providing a service that people, like workers, would want, right? Like people working in a cooperative might want XYZ service, and if they decide that like part of their surplus will go to like this nonprofit because it's providing a service that they or the community wants, then I think you're right. Like, it couldn't be like massive. It couldn't be like a massive nonprofit, but it was like a smaller nonprofit that like would rely on grant services. Right? Like, I think we're mixing up like what a nonprofit is. Like, a nonprofit is just kind of like it's a tax designation that any group can choose, and I think depending on your board, your levels of accountability, like a nonprofit can be good or bad. And so if like there is like some entity that you have created and it's like supposed to be providing some service, and you're like, we don't want this to rely on grants, like we want this to rely, like, but it would have to be the worker's choice. Like I think even with Arizmendi, like it's written into bylaws maybe that like they're gonna put this back into this parent organization. You could presumably do the same thing with any co-op, but it would have to be a choice. It would have to be like, yeah, this is what we're gonna do with our surplus.
So let's continue this conversation and incorporating some of our discussions about failures or pitfalls, or what jumped out to people in that conversation.
So you mentioned one already, that if a nonprofit starts a co-op might never actually become independent because that relationship has some
too much codependency, too much co-branding, right? Where one brand is so linked to the other, they don't want to, the nonprofit doesn't want to give it up, or maybe even the co-op wouldn't do well without the nonprofit brand, or either of those circumstances. What else?
I mean, I guess that one isn't just the pitfall. We talk a lot about the pitfalls, but sort of coming to a close, what are positive ways in which, like us as Worcester Roots Project, or the Environmental Justice League of Rhode Island, or the Regional Environmental Council, or other nonprofits in Rhode Island and Worcester, can actually support local economies in ways that don't, that aren't competitive or conflict creating, or placing the needs of the nonprofit over those of the cooperatives that are starting up. Like, one example is like running this Coop Academy, right? Like, we're not looking to use any of you as revenue streams. I mean, like, we're definitely not. The idea is to provide resources and training and hopes, because that's part of what Worcester Roots' mission is already.
So teaming up with a nonprofit that's critical of nonprofits is a great
Let's see.
Any other? So should we go to each co-op now? So let's think about each co-op and your relationships to nonprofits really quick, and see what are some of the next things you need to know, or you got out of this that is useful for your co-op to move forward. So let's go co-op, and several people from each co-op maybe can chime in. How about we start with Diggers?
Okay. So, so Diggers is benefiting from relationship with Worcester Roots Project. It has allowed us to sort of bumble into being, and given us some space and time to sort of start to figure some things out. And then, of course, the Coop Academy has really been very helpful. There are a lot of things that we still need to, things like bank account, things that make the relationship is not always smooth. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, just what Nene said about the fact that it was like having a symbiotic relationship, and like the co-op having some service that it sort of needs from the nonprofit. I feel like the Diggers has that in Roots. There's like, we use the office, currently the truck, but lots of other like, soil testing things and trainings, and the whole incubation like process is completely under Worcester Roots. So I feel like, over time, a question that I would, want to figure out is like, how long term do we figure out how what the relationship is. Like, is that going to change when we're when and if in the bank account, but if we have our own bank account and do all of our own stuff, do we still how do we still help Roots, and in what capacity? But yeah, I think that what you were saying earlier, Matt, can it work? I think it definitely can. I don't think it has. So maybe the model that's been used maybe hasn't been totally sound. Maybe the nonprofit needs to have, the mission of the nonprofit needs to be on incubation for it to really work, or on because that mission drift could happen otherwise.
Great. Any other ideas for Diggers moving forward in this relationship? Okay. How about Forza? Final thoughts from this, or next steps, things we need to think about?
Yeah, I mean, this has been really helpful, really clarifying, because I think it's just clarifying. We're at a really good point right now where we haven't taken any concrete steps. We've just been talking about the idea and developing the idea. and it's helping me really frame, like, I think the next set of questions that we need to ask ourselves is what exactly does Fuerza Laboral as a nonprofit want to be getting out of this? Because we've been going into it so far with like a pretty vague assumption of like, oh, it'll kill two birds with one stone and we'll be able to make money for the organization and employ our members in a democratic workplace, and like, wouldn't that be great? And not really thinking about like the dynamics of how those two things would happen together. And I think this is clarifying for me. I think we need to pick one of those as the priority. And I think, to be honest, like, my interest in all this was in figuring out a way, like, my primary interest was in figuring out a way for Fuerza to be sustainable. And I don't know what the primary interest of other folks at the table is. Like, that hasn't been totally clarified, because obviously we all care a lot about creating democratic workplaces too. But like, as someone who's trying to help Fuerza become sustainable, that's my pulse. So after hearing this conversation, I'm thinking a cooperative initiative is not the way to do that for Fuerza. So then I'm just not sure, like, okay, then what's the next step? And if people still feel committed to it based on like wanting to start a cool, democratic workplace kind of project, that's awesome. But then it's just strikes me that takes a whole other set of like resources and time. So I kind of like thinking about it. I think you were saying this, Asa, maybe you didn't use this word, but like that it's thinking about what we could do as on a spectrum of like, maybe at one end here is like a little bit of a small social enterprise, and then that social enterprise could maybe grow and grow, and at some point if it wanted to become independent and be a co-op, it could potentially do that, but that would be, yeah. But maybe not thinking of it as like, we're gonna start a co-op or not. Maybe there's something in between that could like generate income and be a cool job development program.
Any other thoughts for first?
Yeah, I think it's hard to think about the two things. I don't know if it's like, like, when we had a Coop Academy in 2004, I think it was, in Providence, and 3 co-ops came to become co-ops, and one of them was really successful because it was under the umbrella of a union, and it was a daycare, the child care providers, and they were a co-op for a while, and then they decided to go back to be a union, and another one was the worker, it was like a job placement worker co-op, so like the members will be part of it, and whatever jobs they find, it's like an agency, a working agency, but temporary agency, but with members. So you would call a member, and these are the jobs you want, any of those kind of thing. But I think the issue with that, it was the two things. They wanted to do the two things. They wanted to like make money for the work agency and also provide good jobs. So they didn't provide pretty good jobs because they were like temp jobs for not, with not compensation, or like workers' comp wasn't there, or any job security, and so it didn't work, right? Like it wasn't viable. You can't do both. So I think it would be interesting to see in Fuerza where I feel like kind of bias for you was like, okay, I see in this nonprofit suffering for the lack of money, and we need a money stream that is more sustainable, and maybe for people who are like, no, what we need is just jobs and a just place. So it's like, and so I wanted to see what, at the end, but I think, it's a good idea to have those conversations, because at the end they're going to be the ones, carrying if they think that's, money for the nonprofit, and if that's the idea, they probably not need to be a co-op, could be just a business. But it would be great if it's a co-op, but if everybody decides that that's what it's going to be, and it's not going to be like people making $25 an hour because they're going to have to pay $10 to the co-op, and it's just going to be $15 an hour because you have to give $10 belongs to the nonprofit. That might work too, right?
From Worcester Roots' perspective, I think we came into it thinking, oh, maybe we'll be less grant dependent, so Worcester's will be generating some profit and giving back in. I don't think we really have that strategy much anymore, but what we are finding is that more and more funders and potential donors get it, and they see, okay, well, if this group can really incubate some co-ops, create some jobs, do a lot of training with youth and build a green economy, then we want to support them, right? And if they can show success in that area. So maybe, we are benefiting from the success of these co-ops, but not directly from their income stream, from the perspective of the nonprofit.
Yeah, just to point on that, I think to go back to your nonprofit's mission is largely to incubate the co-ops, right? So in Worc's case, where it's largely about organizing another thing besides the co-op formation, then suddenly you've got this income stream, it's sexy to do these co-ops and they might fund that, and you're growing this, and you're like, well, are we drifting from our mission?
I think Worcester's case was very intentional mission drift, and that it wasn't. I mean, in some cases it was us getting pulled into cooperatives, but like these projects that we initially started as environmental justice projects, and then the cooperatives as, well, let's structure them that way so that they're democratic.
Yeah.
But I think it's unreasonable to expect that of every nonprofit. Like some nonprofits have a very specific mission for a reason, and they don't do cooperative incubation for a reason. It's not they're designed to.
Our
Yeah, well, I would echo much of what Judy said. We're obviously in just the pretty beginning stages, so it's hard to really. I mean, it's been interesting to hear the discussion going on, but I can't bring to it, an experiential situation. But I appreciate, the relationship that I see existing with other co-ops and what I project will be our relationship. And then going forward, though, because of our specialized nature of what we're trying to do, obviously we're going to hopefully establish a relationship with Co-op Power, the mothership, as it were. That's not a nonprofit co-op relationship, but it may be subject to some of the pitfalls. So, what we're hearing tonight could just as readily be applied to that. So,
we have two left. We're running a little on time. Global Village.
I think we had the conversation about if you intentional, our idea was intentionally create a nonprofit together with the farm, because the challenging of obtaining grants to owning the land and to have a land trust and all the other stuff, and how the relationship with the farm or other incubated businesses that would be using the land. And I mean, it created a big long conversation the last meeting that we had. A lot of worries about mission drift, about chasing the money instead of doing the work that we wanted to do, and what having parameters. Okay, these things we would do, these things we not do for money, and having that clear. But I think the difference on that end, and that we think in my work, is that they both are going to be, board members of the farm. The members of the farm will be board members of the nonprofit, so it will be a lot of equal decision-making power, that it will be shared with the owners of the housing co-op, and sometimes it will be the same member because they live in the housing complex, and how that could work, but yeah, it's still a big fear of, founder syndrome and having too many hands in the same, in two different things, and being not strong enough to do all the work that we wanted to do, and stretched.
Okay. And for Youth Grow and Drop It Like It's Hot Sauce, I think maybe next time when there's other folks, I know this is a big question for them, so we'll come back to it.
Green Drive as well.
Green Drive as well, yeah. Good point. Soul chickens.
I don't think we have as much say as other people because we don't have like a history with nonprofits and we're starting through a nonprofit. So we're just, I think the main takeaways for me were just thinking about navigating partnerships with nonprofits and just seeing that, not seeing that as something to depend on as a revenue stream for our business, but something that is like, can help us live out our community values or be part of a community or seek to do things that aren't necessarily like marketable as a business, like doing education programs and like seeing that as an avenue to open up other things that we're passionate about but might not be able to do on our own as a business.
Yeah, and maybe also like sort of business to business like services for nonprofits that sort of function as like half for-profit business, half, you know, philanthropic thing. Just, you know, just to be doing business with what's essentially a business that's also doing good in the community.
Okay.
Anybody else?
Any final thoughts on this topic? All right, we'll try to compile some of these ideas, and this could be a workshop that people could take to other places and just facilitate this on this topic if you want to. And we'll try to make these resources, compile those resources that are on that sheet and send those out too.